I thought they needed space, until I realized silence was making me doubt myself. You send a message, no response. You wait, still nothing. So you send another message, softer this time, wondering if you said something wrong. Then you find yourself apologizing for things you're not even sure you did. The silence worked exactly as intended. When someone stops responding, stops engaging, or withdraws their presence, your mind immediately starts searching for explanations. This feels natural. It feels like problem solving. But what if that searching, that self examination, that urge to fix whatever went wrong, what if that's not a bug in the system, but a feature? The confusion you feel when someone goes silent isn't accidental, it's predictable. And when something is predictable, it can be leveraged. The silence that feels like space might actually be pressure. The withdrawal that looks passive might be actively conditioning your responses. Silence functions as pressure because it creates what psychologists call ambiguity stress. When communication stops abruptly, your brain enters a state of uncertainty that demands resolution. This isn't weakness. It's how human social cognition works. We're wired to seek clarity in our social connections because ambiguity in relationships historically meant potential danger or loss of support. Here's the mechanism. Withdrawal of communication creates a gap. That gap generates discomfort. The discomfort motivates action. But here's what makes this particularly effective as a control dynamic. The person who withdrew gets to remain completely passive while you do all the work of trying to restore the connection. They don't have to argue their position. They don't have to defend their behavior. They don't have to negotiate or compromise. They simply stop. And that stopping puts all the pressure on you to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. This is conditioning through omission. Instead of telling you what they want, they remove something you expect: their presence, their responses, their engagement. Your brain fills that absence with possibilities, most of them involving something you did wrong. The silence becomes a blank screen where you project your own doubts and fears. The silence works because it makes you correct yourself. You ask for clarity about something that's been bothering you. Maybe it's about plans that keep changing, or promises that don't get kept, or feeling like you're always the one reaching out. The conversation doesn't go well, not because there's yelling or obvious conflict, but because your concerns seem to disappear into a void. Then the silence starts. Messages go unread. Calls go unanswered. When you're together physically, they're present but not really there. The emotional temperature drops, but nothing is explicitly said about why. Days pass. The silence stretches. You start reviewing the conversation in your mind, looking for where you went wrong. Maybe you were too demanding. Maybe you should have brought it up differently. Maybe you're being too sensitive. The original issue, the thing you wanted clarity about, gets buried under your growing certainty that you've damaged something important. So you apologize. Not for your original concern, but for how you expressed it. For bringing it up at all. For making them uncomfortable. The silence breaks. Things return to normal. But the original issue remains unaddressed, and you've learned something. Bringing up problems leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to discomfort. Discomfort leads to you backing down. In family dynamics, silence often comes with backup. It's not just one person withdrawing, it's the whole system supporting that withdrawal. You raise a concern about a pattern you've noticed, something that affects you directly. Instead of discussion, you get silence from the person involved and subtle pressure from others to give them space or be the bigger person. The family narrative becomes about your inability to let things go, your tendency to create drama, your failure to understand that some people just need time to process. The silence gets reframed as emotional maturity while your desire for resolution gets painted as impatience or aggression. This is particularly effective because it uses your own values against you. You want to be understanding. You want to be patient. You want to be the kind of person who gives others space when they need it. So you wait. And while you wait, the message gets reinforced. Your concerns are less important than their comfort. Your need for clarity is less valid than their need for space. The pattern escalates because it works. Each time you back down, each time you accept the silence as reasonable, you're training yourself to expect less, to ask for less, to settle for ambiguity rather than risk the discomfort of withdrawal. Professional environments add another layer because the withdrawal can be subtle and plausibly deniable. Messages that used to get quick responses now take days. Meetings that included you suddenly happen without you. Information that used to flow freely now requires you to ask specifically. You start monitoring your own communication more carefully. You reread emails before sending them, looking for anything that might have caused the shift. You second guess your tone in meetings. You wonder if you said something wrong, pushed too hard on a project, or stepped on someone's territory without realizing it. You start modifying your behavior based on what you think might restore the previous level of engagement. You become more accommodating, less direct, more careful about expressing disagreement or pushing back on decisions. Meanwhile, the person who withdrew doesn't have to explain their behavior or justify the change in communication. They can maintain that nothing has changed while you do all the work of trying to figure out what you did wrong and how to fix it. The most significant cost of this dynamic isn't the immediate discomfort of being ignored. It's what happens to your internal navigation system over time. When silence is used consistently as a response to your attempts at clarity or boundary setting, you start to lose trust in your own perceptions. You begin to question whether your concerns are valid, whether your need for communication is reasonable, whether you're asking for too much when you want direct responses to direct questions. The ambiguity that silence creates gets filled with self-doubt rather than curiosity about the other person's motivations. This erosion of clarity is gradual. It doesn't happen after one incident of withdrawal. It builds through repetition. Each time you experience silence as a response to legitimate concerns, each time you end up apologizing for bringing something up, each time you accept ambiguity rather than push for clarity, you're training yourself to expect less from your relationships and communications. Your tolerance for unclear situations increases, but not in a healthy way. You become more willing to operate without information, to make decisions based on incomplete data, to accept explanations that don't actually explain anything. This might look like patience or understanding, but it's actually a learned response to avoid triggering withdrawal. The conditioning is particularly effective because it targets your social connection needs. Humans are wired to maintain relationships, to repair ruptures in communication, to seek harmony in their social environment. When silence threatens that connection, your instinct shifts toward actions aimed at restoring it, even if that means abandoning your original position or concern. Over time, you start to monitor yourself constantly. You become hyper-aware of how your words might be received, how your requests might be interpreted, how your needs might be perceived as demands. This self-monitoring is exhausting, and it shifts your focus away from what you actually need and toward what you think others can tolerate. The most insidious part is that this dynamic can exist alongside genuine care and positive interactions. The person who uses silence as pressure isn't necessarily cold or obviously manipulative in other contexts. They might be warm, engaging, and supportive most of the time. This makes the withdrawal even more powerful because it contrasts sharply with their usual availability. Understanding silence as a pressure mechanism changes how these interactions are interpreted. When withdrawal follows an attempt at clarity, it stops reading as a personal failure and starts registering as information. Not about intent, but about how conflict, discomfort, and accountability are handled. In these situations, what shifts first is interpretation, not behavior. Silence no longer signals that something must be fixed immediately. It signals a limit in the other person's willingness to engage directly. The absence of response becomes data rather than a verdict. Patterns matter more than explanations. When withdrawal repeatedly follows questions, boundaries, or requests for clarity, and when reconnection happens without addressing the original issue, the dynamic becomes visible. Not dramatic, not malicious, just consistent. Over time, this recognition alters the internal calculus. Responsibility for the silence stops being automatically assigned inward. The focus moves away from self-correction and toward pattern recognition. What once felt like uncertainty becomes context. Some people are more comfortable with ambiguity than resolution. Some avoid direct communication under stress. These traits aren't inherently wrong, but when they consistently leave one side operating in confusion, the cost becomes measurable. When silence is no longer interpreted as something that must be repaired, it loses much of its leverage. What naturally remains is a clearer picture of how communication actually functions within the relationship, and whether that structure supports clarity or sustains doubt. At that point, silence no longer defines the situation, it simply describes it.